7. So in particular, what I want to walk you through is activity B. We're actually going to be calculating descriptive statistics in Excel. And you can see I've got the Excel data sheet open and I've got four spreadsheets within this Excel file. So I've got reaction time. You can see down the bottom left-hand corner here. We've got data for standing balance experiment, data from a juggling experiment, and a muscular fitness tests. That we've collected over time. So if we start with the reaction time, you can see what we need to do up here, as well as obviously in the instruction sheet if you've got it. We basically want to calculate these descriptive statistics for both the dominant hand data and the non-dominant hand data that we've got. You might recognize this data from the class experiment that we've done with online reaction times in class, and some of this might be your data as well. So first thing we want to do when we calculate these is to figure out a location where we want that to go. So I want the average of the dominant hand data to go down here. You can see I've conveniently got titles for this spreadsheet, and we're going to put them in for the other spreadsheets as well. And so right here, I want the average data for dominant hand, or the average from the dominant hand data on this column here. Now, how am I going to calculate average? There's a number of ways to do this in Excel. Like most things in Excel, there is a lot of ways to do things. So one way we could do it is in the formula bar here, I could put equals, and then I could manually click each cell that I want in the average and add them all up. So I could add all of these cells up and divide by the number of participants here, divide it by 24 and get the average that way. Of course, that would be pretty time consuming. And so there is a few quicker ways. One of them is to use a formula or function in Excel. And I'll show you how to do that now. So I can use functions by hitting equals and typing them in. So here I want to use the average function that's inbuilt to Excel. So I type AVERAGE in capitals, open bracket, and you can see it comes up here. And basically, if I input all the numbers I want into the brackets with commas in between, which I can actually just do from selecting all the data, then I'm going to get the average of that data there. So I'm just going to hit return or enter, and I can get the average of that data there. And you can see the cell I've highlighted has the answer there, 0.243, but in the formula bar, it's actually got the function I require. Now, even when doing functions, there's a number of ways to actually do functions. So you might have used functions before by typing them in. Another way to do it is use the insert function bar. So I'm going to do that with median here. I'm going to select the cell that I want the data to go in, and I'm going to click this little FX button or insert function bar or formula builder, depending on whether you're working with PC or Mac. So I should say that I'm working with a MacBook here, and so it might appear a little differently if you're working on a PC, but essentially the processes are very similar, and you'll be able to find your way around based on what I'm talking about here as well. So the insert function is the same. And then whatever list comes up, then you can select the average. Now it might be in a most recently used list, or you might have to search for it. Sorry, I said average there, I meant median. Okay, so we're up to median. I'm gonna double click on that. And then it's selecting some data there. It may be the right data, chances are it won't be. So you can just select the correct data here on the page, and you can check that by looking up in the formula bar and seeing that it's right. So C13 to C36, that's the data I want. So I'm going to hit return or enter, or maybe click OK in the list or little builder that I'm using. Anyway, it's going to return my median number there. So I'm just going to repeat the process for the next two, mode and median. So mode there. Now the thing about mode that you'll see, with this data in particular, if I hit return, I get an NA, and some people are going to get quite concerned about that, but please do bear in mind that there's not always a mode. There's not always a middle number for the data. So if you don't have a middle number, then it's going to return that not available, and that's fine because understanding that there's not always a mode. Standard deviation, luckily there's a function for. I've got it here in my most recently used list that you might be able to see. But what I'm actually going to do is search it, because this can cause people a little bit of difficulty. What you might see in the list over the right-hand side here is a whole range of different standard deviation options, including ones for using text and using different logical arguments and things like that. So a lot of people ask about which standard deviation they should use. Essentially, for our purposes, this unit, you should really just use the simple one, STDEV, okay? And that will return the basic standard deviation function. Again, select the cells that I want, and now I've got a standard deviation. Now, what you'll find with the last one, the range, is that unfortunately, there's no range function built into Excel. But if we have a think about the range, it's essentially the largest score take the smallest score, and there is a maximum and a minimum function. So I'm going to type this one in. I'm going to hit MAX, open bracket, minus MIN, open bracket, and select the same data. So this is going to find the maximum, and then take the minimum from that, and then return that number. And so that you can see there is 0.108. Okay, so I could have separate cells calculating max and min, and then another cell saying that the difference between those two, but I've just done it neatly all within one cell there. So now we've got all our descriptive data for the dominant hand. Now, the question is, do we have to repeat exactly the same process for non-dominant hand? Now, there's a bit of a shortcut here, something that might save you a bit of time. In particular, what we're going to do is use the copy and paste function. Now, when we copy and paste a function in Excel, or even just a formula that we've used in a particular cell, it doesn't actually, or Excel assumes that you don't want to copy the exact data being used in that function, but instead you want to copy the data relative to where that function is being listed. So to explain that, if I copy and paste this average function, so I hit Control C there, but you could right click and hit copy, or take it up to the top of the screen and edit and hit copy. There's a number of ways to copy and paste, obviously. And I'm going to paste here just by hitting Control V. And you can see it's not the same number. And if I select in here, it's actually selected the data above it automatically, because it assumes that, oh, okay, you're copying that, you want the 26 cells above, the average of 26 cells above, to 2 cells above, just like I was doing in this cell here. Now, sometimes that's not what you want, and there's ways around that, but this is a really clever function here because it actually allows us to take that data across without calculating it again. In fact, what we can do is highlight all of our numbers here, and there's a little cursor down the bottom right-hand corner that we can hover over and drag across. Essentially, that's copying and pasting. When we're dragging, we're copying and pasting, and what that does is copies and pastes all of those, and now we have all of those descriptive statistics for the data set here. So this is really useful, and in fact that's how I'm going to complete the next set of worksheets as well, rather than redoing the functions. Before we go on to the next worksheets though, what I want to do is a simple graph for this data. And so I'll just shut this down for a second. There's a number of ways to do graphs, obviously, and in this description, you'll see that it says to visually compare the central tendency. So we could really technically use any central tendency, the average, the median, the mode. You could look at standard deviations or even ranges in a graph. And maybe you're going to create a graph that's actually got a number of those components. But the most simple sort of graph that we tend to see in research is comparing usually the average if the data is normally distributed. We're not going to do checks for that here today, but we will in subsequent tutorials. And if it's not normally distributed, then we might use the median. So let's use the average here. And essentially, the quickest way to create a graph from the averages is just to select the two averages. So we just select those two averages, and then we're going to go to Insert, Chart. Again, this is going to look a little different depending on whether you're on a Mac or a PC, but the functionality is the same. So column graph is probably the most simple way to do it. You can use a 2D or a 3D, it doesn't really matter. And it's automatically going to create the graph from the data you've selected. Now, of course, you can create a graph from scratch and then select this data if you want. This is just a slightly quicker way to do it. Now, this is the bare bones, in a way, of the graph that we want. But something you might notice immediately is what Excel does automatically when it creates a graph is to try to zoom in on the difference between any numbers that it might have there. In particular, the difference between 0.243 and 0.245 is not particularly great as a product of its percentage of those two. So what you'll notice is the bottom here of this graph starts at 0.42. So this looks like a big difference because the graph has been zoomed in and the y-axis here does not start at 0. Now, if you're going to create graphs for visual comparison, you want to make sure it's at 0. So there's different ways to go in and format that. I like to select the y-axis numbers here and right-click Format Axis. And then you'll see that it's got an automatic set of minimum that it's chosen. So I want to override that and hit it to 0. The rest of the automatic functions are okay. And what you can see with our chart here now is that they do look very similar because they are very close to each other. Then we might just change the formatting a little. So I might just delete this because there's only one series. How do we label 1 and 2? Very simply, well, if we go into select data, there's a number of ways to do that. I'm doing that here on the Mac. You might right click over the chart somewhere and it can actually, there's a select data function. So wherever you find it, then I can hit the x-axis labels. So I'm labeling the x-axis, which is just 1 and 2 arbitrarily at the moment. And I'm selecting 2 cells that have the labels for the data we want in there. And that's going to automatically update those to dominant hand and non-dominant hand data. Okay, so depending on where we would use this chart, we might put a chart title in. We wouldn't do that in research, but basically this is the bones or really what we're looking for in terms of a chart that we can look at and say, okay, here's the reaction time, the average reaction time for the dominant hand and non-dominant hand. And I can see they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close to each other. Okay, so now we've completed all the tasks for worksheet 1. I'm just basically going to complete the same descriptive stats for the rest of the worksheets. I'm not going to do the other charts because I think that's fairly straightforward. But what I'm going to do to make things a little quicker is to copy and paste across the titles and then copy and paste across functions, just like we were dragging. Now, if I go in here, you'll see it's selected only some of the data because that's the same length of data that we had in the previous worksheet. But all I need to do is change that. I can drag this up a little bit if I want. So I can drag that up there and hit return, or I might actually type in the cell it starts at. So I want it to stop at C73. You can see that up in the formula bar. I want it to start at C13. So I can just type in C13. Okay. In fact, a quick way to do it would even just be to select this, return. So now I'm just putting in the range that we want. Great. This data, by the way, is from a juggling experiment that we've done in class in previous years, where we've got people to juggle, sorry, not juggling, this is standing balance. So we've done this as a class experiment as well. And so this might be some of your data from the class for the standing experiment that we've done with arms in, arms out. There was quite a range, obviously, of time people took to take a step in that task. And you can see all the data here for descriptive statistics. So that was pretty quick. And we did the copying and pasting. So we'll do that again for the next worksheet here. I'm going to copy and paste that from either the first or the second worksheet. And again, I'm going to select the data I want. Copy and paste the cells, cell range that is. Twice here. And then just drag that across. Great. This was the juggling data I sort of mistakenly said in the previous worksheet. So this was a class experiment we did a few years ago where we got people to practice. You can actually see in some of this data here that most people, obviously, when they juggle, they haven't juggled before or try to juggle, they don't do it for very long. But then there's a couple of people within this data, someone who took it 48 seconds, they've obviously had experience juggling before, or is just extremely talented, and have been able to juggle for a significantly longer time than everyone. So the range is very big, and the standard deviation is quite high at that data. That's stuff that we'll start to explore a little bit more in terms of its distribution in future weeks. But we can easily calculate the descriptive statistics on the method we've just done. This last worksheet here, basically you're doing the same, you're needing to do the same descriptive statistics, but there's a bit of an extra problem here. That problem is that the data is going, instead of down in columns, is going across in rows. Now you can do that, do the same here by having, say, average, standard deviation, and then go across, but it just makes the workflow of it very difficult. And then where we want to copy and paste across in different directions, it also makes it sort of extra difficult. So what I'd recommend is to move the data around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the data. Now, a shortcut for me to do this is to hit Control-Shift or Command-Shift and then hit down. Now that actually selects all the data until there's a blank space, and then I'm going to hold Control-Shift down again, or Command-Shift, and then the right arrow key on my keyboard just once, and again it's going to select all the data until there's blank cells. So this is all the data that I want to actually rearrange. So I want this going down in columns. So what I'm going to do is copy, and then I'm going to paste special. So paste special. And there's an option down the bottom right hand called transpose. Now transpose is to change the orientation. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to change the columns with the rows here. So I'm going to tick that transpose, and what you'll see is the data is just rotated around. Okay, so I'm going to delete this data above here. Now data's how I want it. Again, I'm going to copy and paste what I want. Actually, exactly the same amount of cells, which is fantastic. So then all I need to do is drag that across. Great. So I've got all my data there. Obviously, that descriptive statistics is not going to work for gender. So I'm going to clear that data. But I've got all my descriptive statistics there, and then I can do my graph. One final thing I'll leave you on is the graph says to compare the central tendency of age, height, and body mass between males and females. So to do that, obviously you're going to need an average of, let's say, age as one of the variables between males and females. At the moment, this average is both males and females. So to select the average female, so let's say average female, and we want average male. So we want those separate. How are we going to do that? Well, we can do average function and just select the age of the females. So I might just select that one, that one, that one, that one. I can continue on. Okay, so that wouldn't take too much time, but there is a quicker way to do it, and I'll show you that. So what you can do here is to highlight this data and to sort it. Now, there's different ways. There's a sort function up the in one of the columns or sort of areas at the top, but the quickest way I find is to right click and then hit sort. You can hit ascending or descending. The important thing is that you're going to get a little warning here saying that you have selected data, and basically this is saying, okay, you've got data that is adjacent to the data that you've selected. So it's assuming that a data in a row is connected, which it is. Participants 1 data should stay with participants 1 data. So it's saying here that should we keep the data together across the rows? That's what it's saying with expand and selection, and you do want to do that. So keep the expand in this case, hit sort, and you can see that it's sorted all the F's from the M's there, and the data stayed the same. So we've got participant 1, 2, 3, but participant 6, 7, 8, 14. So that's no longer 1 through to 8 or 9 or whatever it is. So it's actually kept the participant data along with it. So now we can do that average, but instead of having to individually select, we can just do the average for the females there, and then I can do the average for the males. And now we've got the average for both. So I can just do the same graphing technique that I did on the reaction time worksheet with this muscular fitness test. So basically, that's all the activities that we have for the online tutorial for activity B. I hope that was easy to follow along. If you've got any questions, obviously let us know. This is going to be quite important preparation for the competence exam in week 12. Okay, good luck everyone, and I'll see you online.